Over the past couple of years, Boeing have been going from crisis to crisis, but what about Airbus? How well have they taken advantage of that, and is it fair to say that they've been maybe a little bit complacent? Well, something now has really just happened, and whilst it looked like a bit of a sideshow when it was announced, it actually was way more important than it might seem. This is a move that could signal the development of a brand new Airbus aircraft and could therefore trigger a reaction from Boeing and other competitors. So what was it? Stay tuned. I have focused heavily on Boeing during the last few years, and probably because of that, many of you guys have been asking, when are you going to cover Airbus and what they have been up to? Now, believe me, we have been looking for Airbus stories, but honestly, Airbus are a bit tougher of a nut to crack than Boeing is at the moment. They actually seem to be pretty good at resolving problems quietly before attracting too much attention from the press and also from industry insiders like myself. But that doesn't mean that it's been completely quiet around them. In 2020 and 2022, Airbus settled corruption charges relating to sales of airliners, helicopters and even satellites to various governments worth over $3.7 billion. But that's more or less how these Airbus stories tend to go. You hear something vague about them in the news and then it just kind of fades into the background. The only exception to this was the really public and ugly spat between Airbus and Qatar Airways regarding premature damage to its Airbus A350 fleet, which I've covered on this channel before. And that issue seems to have now been completely resolved. But a little bit more importantly, we haven't really heard of anything concrete from Airbus about any plans to develop something new, or even to take advantage of those Boeing problems. The new Airbus A321XLR has entered service over the past few months, but that's a program that has started quite a while ago, well before Boeing's 737 MAX crisis. The one program that Airbus did launch more recently is a freighter version of its Airbus A350 widebody. Now, that is a threat to Boeing, who have always been the king of air cargo, but while cargo is important, the short and medium-haul side of the passenger jet market is where most of the industry's eyes are right now fixed. And in that market, Airbus has, so far, stayed mostly quiet. The only thing that the European manufacturer has talked about over the past few years that would fit in this particular size category is its Zero E program, which is an Airbus group of concepts for future hydrogen-powered aircraft. Since launching Zero E in 2020, Airbus have publicly stated that they aim to put the first hydrogen airliner into service by the middle of the 2030s, but they haven't formally launched anything specific yet. Now, before making that decision, Airbus would likely need to flight test a few different concept ideas of such aircraft, plus they would need to ensure that things like the production and supply of renewable hydrogen would make the program feasible in the first place. Now, it would be unfair to say that Airbus haven't been working on any technologies that would be useful for something new in the size category of an Airbus A320 or a 737 during this time. For example, they have long-running projects like the Wing of Tomorrow, examining both the design and manufacturing of composite aircraft wings. Now, I'm sure that many of you know that Airbus already makes composite wings for its A350, and they also have such wings made for the Airbus A220 by Spirit Aerosystems in Belfast, Northern Ireland. But getting that technology ready for replacing the production of the Airbus A320 wing, for example, is much harder. Today, large sections of these composite wings needs to be put together in special jigs, and then they need to be cured or basically baked in wing-sized pressurized ovens called autoclaves. That process isn't just expensive, it's also time-consuming and difficult to scale up to high rates of production. Now, this isn't necessarily a deal breaker for wide bodies like the Airbus A350, whose production rates are relatively low, like currently around 10 to 12 aircraft per month. But single-aisle aircraft obviously have much higher production rates than that. Airbus currently makes well over 40 Airbus A320neo family jets per month, and they're aiming at eventually getting that number up to even higher, around 70 aircraft or even more. Now, the Airbus A220 is getting awesome reviews from both airlines and customers, but its composite wing is actually one of the reasons why Airbus is really struggling to increase its production rate up to the double digits per month, which is really needed in order to make that program profitable. Now, there are technologies that could help increase production of things like composite wings, like an out-of-autoclave curing, and both Airbus and Boeing have been working on them for years. But again, so far, there's no real program for a new Airbus or Boeing aircraft that would be attached to these new technologies. So, these design and manufacturing developments have therefore been for the future, along with other new potential building blocks or technology bricks, as Airbus likes to call them, like thermoplastic fuselages, which are both lighter and quicker to put together than other composites are. And crucially, despite the apparent lack of any new aircraft program on the horizon, Airbus has been progressing with all of these technology bricks, so that kind of begs the question, what are they for? Well, one hypothesis from many analysts has been that Airbus could simply use these technologies to update something. They could, for example, re-wing the Airbus A320 family and maybe also lengthen the Airbus A321 to add a few more seats to it. Or perhaps they could even update the production of the Airbus A220 to increase output and finally make that one profitable. But more recent developments are actually pointing somewhere completely different. You see, Airbus might instead be about to launch an all-new replacement for the Airbus A320 family. And that aircraft would obviously benefit from all of these possible design and production improvements, and from updates in engines, which I'll get back to shortly. So, why am I saying this? What did Airbus do that makes a launch of a new aircraft using all of these technologies much more likely now? Well, as it turns out, it's all hidden in an obscure interview. But before I get to that, I want to briefly mention something else that's taking off. And that's your personal data that's likely being sold all around the internet without you even knowing it, which brings me to today's sponsor, Delete Me. Information like your home address, phone numbers, and even social media profiles and information about your family is likely right now being sold without your knowledge or consent by hundreds of shady entities known as data brokers. This is why you're getting more and more spam messages and robocalls, and that's exactly what also happened recently to our editor, Dominic. Now, he finally got tired of wading through endless spam in his inbox and therefore contacted Delete Me, who immediately got to work scanning and individually removing his data from all of these brokers. He then received handy weekly reports updating him on their progress. And the best part is that Delete Me will continue to work on protecting your integrity all year around for as long as you stay with them. This has meant that Dominic now has more time to focus on creating awesome content for you guys, which makes me very happy. Now, if you want to do the same as Dom and get 20% off Delete Me's US consumer plans, then use this QR code or go to joindeleteme.com/mentor now with the code MENTORNOW. Thank you so much to Delete Me for sponsoring this video. Now, let's get back to the story. So the move that Airbus recently made, which caught our attention, is simple and on the face of it seemingly irrelevant. It has to do with those plans for a hydrogen-powered aircraft that I mentioned before. Basically, Airbus no longer believes that introducing such an aircraft by the mid-2030s is realistic. Now, I want to be absolutely clear here that this is not really a story about hydrogen aircraft. But this Airbus decision certainly has some nice, interesting, nerdy takeaways with it. Like, for example, their reasoning that the limiting factor for hydrogen is not so much the aircraft side of things, but instead the availability of a proper hydrogen ecosystem that would realistically be able to produce, transport, store and deliver hydrogen to airports worldwide. It is also worth noting here that Airbus didn't break this story in a traditional press release. Instead, this appeared in the French press when Airbus were responding to questions from a French trade union, where they revealed that they had cut the budget for the Zero-E hydrogen program by 25%. And crucially, Airbus has also cancelled plans to run an Airbus A380 testbed with a fifth hydrogen engine mounted high up on its fuselage. Airbus originally had plans to test two versions of this concept, a small jet engine that would burn hydrogen and a hydrogen fuel cell setup with an electric motor running a propeller. Now, this cancellation is important because that testbed was supposed to show the effects of operating such engines at high altitudes. For example, they would show if burning hydrogen in a jet engine would create really thick contrails, which could cause some problems. But why is this decision so important right now? Well, one key detail, which I didn't mention before, is that the original 2035 service entry goal for the first hydrogen-burning Airbus meant that Airbus' next new airliner would therefore definitely run on hydrogen. Airbus has made that very clear when they launched the Zero E program in 2020, and they've also then repeated that same thing in 2022. Now, since then, Airbus have been trying to kind of water down those statements a little bit. In various interviews from 2023 and onwards, Airbus CEO Guillaume Faury has suggested that the next generation of Airbus aircraft could do a little bit of both. He has mentioned that this new aircraft could have versions running on jet fuel or sustainable aviation fuels and other versions with hydrogen tanks on board. Now, on the face of it, those plans have always sounded a little bit questionable. You see, unlike jet fuel, which we can easily store in our aircraft wings, hydrogen needs pressurized and supercooled cylindrical or even spherical tanks that therefore needs to be inside of the fuselage. Now, in theory, you could design an aircraft that could handle both, but the whole point of developing an all-new airline design, rather than to just update something with new wings and engines, is to take advantage of all available technological advancements. To do this, the new design would need to be optimized around a specific setup, so compromising by offering such radically different options seems, well, really expensive and also an additional complication on something that's already quite complicated. So with that in mind, up until now, we didn't really know what Airbus was truly up to. They could be following a two-step approach with, let's say, an updated Airbus A220 that would include new engine options, plus a long-promised stretch, making it compete better towards, for example, the Boeing 737. And they could then have that version run on sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, in addition to normal jet fuel. Then as a second step, they could still plan to introduce a small hydrogen aircraft design, for example, something with 50 to 80 seats, that would replace turboprops like the ATR-72 and the de Havilland-8. And they could then create something even bigger in that format a little bit later. So why change that now? Well, the news is that Airbus believes that the Zero E hydrogen program could get delayed by as much as 10 years to around 2045 or so. That's quite a big delay for a 4.5-year-old program. And crucially for this video, that new timeline means that Airbus now need an all-new aircraft, something running on normal jet fuel or SAF. And they need to launch that aircraft and bring it to market reasonably soon. So why is that then? Well, firstly, it is getting more and more clear that the market needs newer, even more efficient aircraft. I recently made a video where I looked at Embraer and whether or not they could become a real threat to Boeing and Airbus. And the main point that I made in that video was that the market really wants them to design and build a larger aircraft to possibly compete with the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737. Now, since we released that video, Aviation Week released a survey showing just how much the airlines and lessors wanted a third player like Embraer to enter the fray. Now, a lot of the respondents to that survey said that they would support Embraer purely because they think that a third player would be a good and healthy thing for the industry. But crucially, 44% of respondents also said that they would be happy if that new aircraft could give them a 20% saving over current Airbus A320neos and 737 Maxes. And another 32% said that they would be satisfied with only a 15% saving. Now, that's super important because Boeing, for example, has previously said that they wouldn't launch a new airliner until they could get an efficiency gain of 25% or more over the 737 MAX. But in reality, only 25% of respondents felt that such a high improvement would be necessary. Now, I'm not trying to suggest here that Airbus might be afraid of Embraer. That's not really the point here. Instead, what these numbers show is that in general, customers are much more ready for a new plane than Boeing and perhaps Airbus previously thought. But even to get that 20% saving that the airlines and the lessors want, Airbus would realistically need the engine and airframe improvements that only an all-new design could bring. And on top of that, there is also a simpler reason why Airbus needs to introduce this all-new airliner right now. You see, if we really will see a generation of hydrogen-powered aircraft starting by the mid-2040s, then any new design that gets introduced before that will have a limited amount of time to recoup that investment. Now, of course, the first hydrogen-powered aircraft will almost certainly be smaller, so an aircraft the size of an Airbus A321, for example, will likely still have quite some time to stay relevant. But in any case, the point here is that now we have a much better idea of what Airbus is up to. And that change in strategy isn't affecting just them. In fact, a move like that would completely rebalance the competitive field around jet engines, which immediately brings me to something a little bit awkward. You see, just recently I made a video about the Rolls-Royce Ultrafan, and I explained how Airbus and Rolls could bolt it onto an Airbus A350 to create an Airbus A350neo, and that Boeing then wouldn't have an answer to that, probably for years. But in that same video, I also said that since Boeing is still busy with its own problems, Airbus isn't in a hurry to launch a replacement for the A320neo family. Now, obviously I recorded that before reviewing this survey that I just showed you and before considering the possibility of these recent changes that Airbus has announced. And in any case, the point here is that a new aircraft from Airbus, or Boeing for that matter, will aim to replace the most popular airliners that are now available in the world. And there's no question that all of the major engine manufacturers will want a piece of that pie. As I said in that Rolls-Royce video, the British engine maker was at one time talking with Boeing about a version of that engine for a potential 737 replacement, the 797. So them instead making one of these engines for an Airbus A320 replacement is obviously a no-brainer. Pratt & Whitney already make a version for their geared turbofan for the Airbus A320neo, and a newer version of that, perhaps making use of newer materials that solve some of its early problems, would almost certainly be a good fit for this newer plane as well. That leaves CFM, the 50-50 venture between General Electric and Safran, who makes the LEAP 1 engine for both the Airbus A320neo and the 737 MAX families. And here things are a little bit more complicated, because CFM is also developing a more radical, open fan design called the CFM Rise. Now, as I've explained in other videos, that engine is probably the most promising in terms of raw efficiency gains, but an aircraft the size of an Airbus A320 or the 737 would likely need to be configured and built specifically in order to use it. And that's because the effective diameter of this engine is going to be truly huge. Imagine trying to fit an engine for a Boeing 777 under the wing of an Airbus A320 and you get the idea. To make that work on a low-wing aircraft, like most airliners that we have today are, the wing would need to be bent upwards in kind of a gull-wing configuration. And I have actually shown that Airbus has already presented a concept like that a while back, so there's no question that they're considering the Rise for any future project that they might be working on. But in addition to any other development challenges, choosing an engine like that would effectively make this Airbus A320 replacement a single-engine option aircraft. Now, that's something that Airbus haven't seemed to mind for its wide-bodies. The A350 and the A330neo currently have only Rolls-Royce engines, for example, but for their single-aisle aircraft, Airbus has traditionally preferred to offer a choice of at least 2 different engines. That's what they did with the original A320 family and then repeated for the Airbus A320neo family as well. So if that's what they want this time around as well, well then the Rise option fan might not be the best choice. Of course, there's nothing stopping CFM from offering a more conventional engine as an option. Perhaps a LEAP with a geared fan borrowing from some of the lessons that they've learned in the Rise program. In fact, that's what I think that CFM will ultimately do here. Now, obviously, there's also another industry player that would be affected by this Airbus move that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's Boeing. What would Boeing do if Airbus suddenly launches an Airbus A320 replacement with a service entry at around 2035 or so? Or if I put it another way, what can they do? Well, I don't have a crystal ball here, but given the recent changes in the United States, I find it very hard to imagine that the new administration would let Boeing fall even further behind from where they already are. In the past, the US and Boeing have accused the European Union of subsidizing and otherwise supporting Airbus, but now I wouldn't be surprised to see Boeing get a bit or even a lot of state funding, frankly just to help them stand on their feet and take on such a gigantic challenge. Because a gigantic challenge it would definitely be. Finally, another factor here is that whenever a manufacturer replaces an existing aircraft family with something new, there is an inevitable risk that some customers who have already ordered the existing aircraft will switch over to the new type if they can afford to wait a little bit longer. Now, normally, aircraft manufacturers really don't like this because they get most of their money when they deliver each new plane to their customers. So switching orders to planes that will get delivered even later will hurt their liquidity a lot. But Airbus today has a crazy long backlog for new aircraft orders. If you order a new Airbus A321neo today, you might not get it until in about 8 years or even longer than that. So this means that Airbus doesn't actually have a lot to lose. If some or even a lot of customers switches over to this new aircraft, that will just mean that they can offer quicker deliveries to their more impatient existing customers, and deliveries will just continue. And with that, the cash will keep rolling in, allowing the funding of the newer aircraft to go ahead without any problems. Now, there is of course much more to be said here. We're recording this before the Airbus annual press conference on the 20th of February, where we will probably learn much more about the company's coming plans. And in that press conference, Airbus will likely have to answer to some really unhappy regulators or legislators who really don't want to see any delays in their hydrogen plans. And we still need to see the reaction of Embraer and other players in the industry. So what do you think? Will we see a new Airbus aircraft being announced within the coming year? And what engines, materials and other features would you want to see in it? Let me know in the comments below. Now, I hope that you will give a very warm welcome to my friend and colleague Ben, who is starting to present videos here on Mentour now. He has almost exactly the same background as me and is an active Boeing 737 instructor and examiner, so I am really happy to have him joining the team. And as you can see, we keep expanding our production and quality, and that's made possible only with the help of my fantastic Patreon supporters as well as our sponsors. And you can find links on how to join Patreon or to my sponsor both here in the description below or by using these QR codes. And if you like this episode, you will absolutely love this older video, which I suggest that you check out next. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt, you're watching Mentour now. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.